Welcome to Talking Politics Q&A. Robert and I are primed to answer your questions, so let's crack straight into it. David Hall, should Labour be prioritising going after the growing number of reform voters or disaffected Tories who will never vote reform? I would say that Labour probably shouldn't be thinking about it in those specific terms. I think they have to think about themselves as a very broad coalition dominating the centre ground who seem simply more palatable than any of the alternatives. I think there is some advantage to them in suggesting that the Tories are finished and that the contrast and the choice is with reform, because reform is untested, reform is perceived to be further right than the Tories. And I think if they can genuinely dominate the centre ground, I guess it depends how well people feel they're doing as a government. But I don't think it really helps them to think about it in the terms that David suggests. What do you think?
So a bit of recent history. On election night, it was very, very clear to me that in the UK as a whole, the majority of voters were essentially on the left. And actually, I said in our overnight programme, the rational thing...
What's the evidence of that, though?
Just if you add together the vote shares of Lib Dems, Greens, Labour, SNP, it is more than...
But sorry, just to stop you there for a moment, because I just want to...
Yeah.
The Tory government was very, very, very unpopular. We all anecdotally knew lots and lots of dyed-in-the-wool Tories who were like, I'm done with them. They've had it. They need a break. They've had their chips, whatever you want to call it. So what we don't know is how many people who voted Labour, Lib Dem, and were actually left-wingers. We just know that they were very...
whether they're actually... I'm not saying they... I'm not talking about, Corbynista style left. I'm just saying... I'm just saying there was a majority of people who were voting for voters... Sorry, there was a majority of people who were voting for parties that would define themselves as, even just a fraction to the left of the centre. I mean, obviously there are centrists in all these in all these parties. So broadly, I said on that overnight programme, I said the rational place for Starmer to position his party is essentially as a sort of soft progressive party. Then what they did for a number of months was to decide that reform was this great threat, and they were worried about seeing their votes ebb away to reform. And they then started to define themselves as sort of reform light, and were saying things that many of their supporters would have regarded as reactionary. Now, they then noticed in the local elections that was a catastrophic strategy, because all they'd really done was to validate and endorse reform by moving in that direction. So reform does incredibly well in terms of councillors, and indeed Labour loses that important by-election. So I was quite struck that in an interview that Starmer gave a few days ago to his sort of semi-official biographer, Tom Baldwin, he said to Tom Baldwin that he was now going to position Labour as progressive, and he was going to attack reform from a so-called progressive position. We have no idea what that actually means. It may be that he's trying to make a virtue of the way that he capitulated on welfare reform. Obviously that capitulation was a terrible humiliation and has caused them all sorts of financial problems. And in fact, in our previous episode, we talked in some detail about the scale of those financial problems that he faces. But absent from capitulating on the question of making it more difficult for vulnerable disabled people to get the personal independence payment, not a lot of sign yet about what he means by being more progressive, but those were his words, and you have to take him at his word. And actually, as it happens, I think that is the rational. And I've never changed my position. I think that it is. I think that the worst thing that was happening to Labour with this Reform Light thing was that it was just alienating the very large numbers of voters who will vote tactically. They were just so there were quite large numbers of people who would have considered voting Labour, who just hated so much this position, particularly on welfare reform, that many of them were saying, well, I'm just, I'm either not going to vote at all, or I'm obviously going to vote Green or Lib Dem, but never Labour ever again.
I think a lot of it is how you talk about it as well. If you're a broad centrist party trying to dominate the centre ground and trying to govern for all the people of the country, you do have to address things people are concerned about. And lots of people on all sides of the political spectrum are concerned about immigration, particularly the small boats arrivals. So I think it seems to me perfectly plausible to do things that are addressing that, which do in their own way undercut reform, but to talk about it in the language that you would expect from a progressive Labour leader.
Well, you've got to do it in a humane way. The Island of Strangers remark that he made, which he now says, he only read on the day and is... Well, actually, I said this on this podcast, that his design speechwriter had no idea, allegedly, of the Powell connotations. He now admits that was a terrible mistake. The reason, however, it didn't look like a mistake is because of the way they were aping reform rather than just tackling practical problems in a more humane Labour way. So you're absolutely right. Just because you're on the left of politics doesn't mean that you don't want to stop asylum seekers risking their lives and their children's lives by crossing the channel in these small boats. And it's a perfectly credible left-wing position to say, it's ridiculous that we're spending an absolute fortune housing these people in hotels. So all of that are real problems that any party should be confronting, but it's the way that you confront them.
Yeah, and
and the language.
Yeah, and I think the final point is that what the broad mass of voters want to see, including reform voters, is the problem being addressed. Yeah. It's completely unconvincing when you watch a progressive Labour leader starting to ape reform language, because then people think, well, you're not addressing the underlying problem and you're trying to ape their language, which we don't consider authentic. And we've talked about authenticity quite a bit before on this podcast. Let's move on. James Stride, who is the Norman Tebbit of politics today? Good question. Not necessarily a Tory, but a politician who completely lives and breathes their party's policies. I'm tempted to say Angela Rayner, not because I think we should probably say, for those who are listening or watching this and don't really know who Norman Tebbit was, Norman Tebbit was... he was famously lampooned on the satirical show Spitting Image as a Chingford skinhead in a leather jacket. He was a conviction politician. He was very, very loyal to Margaret Thatcher. He was tough. He was blunt. Lots of people didn't like him. He came up with some of the most famous quotes of Thatcherism about, you should get on your bike to get a job, which offended a great many people who were unemployed, but, dyed in the wool Thatcherites loved him for that bluntness. Is there anyone? I pick Angela Rayner just because she's a big character.
No, but also she's also authentic.
Anyone else?
I think Angela is a very astute choice. That you've made. I am struggling to find an equivalent in the current Tory party. One of the things that, as you say, he had convictions. He didn't stand on ceremony. He was a sort of real person. And I think one of the problems that so many of our current, and Angela is definitely a real person. And the thing about Angela is that she also has a sort of emotional intelligence. I don't know the extent to which Norman Tebbit had that. I've met him a few times over the years. I wasn't particularly close to him, but like everybody, I think, who was sort of conscious of politics at the time, we all admired the way that he, to an extent, sacrificed his political career to look after his wife, who had that was disabled in the awful Brighton bombing by the IRA. And to that extent, again, he just came across as a thoroughly decent human being, even for those people who didn't like his particular brand of right-wing Thatcherite politics.
I know there's always such a danger, isn't there, that you kind of lionize the politics and the politicians of the past. But I sometimes do think about, the Michael Heseltines and the Norman Tebbits and the Neil Kinnocks, and they do seem slightly. I mean, one of the reasons why I think, not to say that I like or dislike her policies, I'm not commenting on her policies at all, but like Angela Rayner just seems like a big figure, the kind of figures we got used to growing up covering politics, and don't seem to be around in such numbers anymore. And I feel like I don't know Angela Rayner at all really, but I feel like politics would be the poorer probably if she left it. And it's hard to see too many other people who come across in that kind of big political figure way. Is that fair, or am I just being a bit unfair on the...
No, it's totally true. I mean, look, I think there are two issues. One is personality and bravery. And I think that in the past there were braver politicians, definitely. I also think there were brainier politicians. I mean, I was looking back at governments in the 70s and 80s, did stupid things as well as doing.
They had their problems, I think, as
well as doing good things. But the quality, the intellectual quality of the politicians of the time, whether we're talking about Thatcher's cabinet, I went to see, or indeed, the earlier generation of Labour leaders. I went to see, I thought, a very endearing bit of political history in a play called Gang of Three that was on comparatively recently. And it was about the sort of battle for leadership of the right wing of the Labour Party in the 70s between Tony Crosland, Dennis Healey, and Roy Jenkins. And the point about all three of them was, and I don't say this as a way of any sense trying to denigrate or put down the current generation of politicians, but they were all big intellects who wrote books, read lots of books, had a broad interest, had hinterlands, just in a way that more or less nobody around today does. And that's bad. That's bad for democracy.
Michael Laws asks, is Nigel Farage's £250,000 offer to non-doms to avoid tax great politics, even if it's questionable economics? I would say, in answer first, that it's terrible politics, in my view. I think the non-dom tax problem is principally political, not...
So economic is what you mean?
Well, I think its problems are political problems, not economic, and you'll have it, defer to your more valuable view on the economics of it, but on the politics of it. I mean, I remember the 2015 election campaign, Cameron versus Miliband. I would say the only good bona fide good day Ed Miliband had was the day he decided to attack the Tory party's policy on non-doms. And I just think that the trouble is, it's a very, very difficult sell to your average British taxpayer, the idea that there are people who can come and live here for potentially a long time who are not subject to the same tax regime we are, good, bad, or indifferent. Whether you like the tax regime or you don't like the tax regime, I think the politics of that is pretty terrible, and we can argue about the economics.
So it is interesting to me that Nigel Farage thinks it's popular, indeed populist, to come up with a policy to try and attract lots of wealthy individuals from abroad. I think he calls it his Britannia card from memory. You pay $250,000 and you get enormous tax advantages from settling in the UK. And I just don't know whether the views of British people have changed very significantly since, as you say, that Cameron-Miliband debate, when it's definitely the case that large numbers of British people would have said good riddance if these wealthy people left these shores. Farage thinks public opinion may well have changed. Now, this also, so just to be clear, on his almost every accountant and expert on this that I've spoken to says that Farage's policy would cost this country a fortune, right? So as Michael says, it's probably not good economics, but there is, Farage has identified, a very tricky issue for the current government. So Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, basically scraps most of the non-dom tax advantages. He's fundamentally responsible for this policy. And then Rachel Reeves follows up, toughening him up a bit, and also includes something which these wealthy people from overseas hate, which is that if you're here for a bit of time, you will have to end up paying inheritance tax when you pop your clogs on your worldwide assets. Now, quite a lot of wealthy people just say over indeed, their dead bodies, and they are leaving.
I shouldn't be laughing at this, but
they are leaving, because the one thing they do not want to do is incur UK inheritance tax on very large global estates, very large amounts of wealth held overseas. So quite a lot of them are leaving. There are economists, there are business people who are now warning that so many of these people are leaving, that it is having an economic impact, whether it's in terms of, the money they spend here, whether it's in terms of the money they put into British businesses, the investments they make. And there is definitely unease at the Treasury about whether Rachel Reeves went too far. And so another U-turn we may well see. In fact, there are some people very close to government who say it's inevitable we will see, is she will remove the inheritance tax. She'll remove the decision to impose inheritance tax on these people while trying to keep the rest of it. Now, I have to say, if she does do that, I think with the left, that will...
I think that would be suicide on a different... the idea of imposing tax rises on, quotes, ordinary working Britons, while letting billionaires off their inheritance tax payments.
The politics of it are... But
suicidal.
The politics of it are terrible, but the economics of where we are on this is also difficult. So it sort of goes to the heart of, the real contradictions in where this government is at the moment. It's sort of in the tension between we want growth on the one hand, but on the other hand, we want what most of our members and our MPs think of as being fair. And these two things are fighting against each other big time at the moment.
These conversations make me ever more pleased that we're not sitting here. We often debate what it would be like to sit in the Treasury. We're quite pleased we're not. Kevin de Cruz, why is it costing £10,000 as a deposit to stand in the mayoral elections next year? Brackets as an independent, it's way beyond our means and only favours the big parties who have the big money. I don't particularly have a view on this, except to suppose that I suppose it's because they don't want 10,000 candidates.
It's no more than that. It's just that they, I don't think it's £10,000 for all mayoral elections. It's true of London.
Yeah.
I think it might be 5,000 for some of the others, like Greater Manchester. But the point is that it is supposed to mean, because the thing about a deposit is you get it back. I think if you get 5% or more of the vote, you get it back. If you get less than 5%, you lose it. And so it is designed to eliminate frivolous candidates. I mean, is it quite the right level? I don't know whether 10K is the right level.
Does seem quite a lot.
It is. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, I'm absolutely certain Kevin is, not a crank because he listens to this podcast. But I mean, the question is, how many cranks do we want? How many cranks do we actually want running in this? It's quite a tricky thing. This.
Paul asked, how can the Lib Dems take advantage of Labour and Conservative failings? I think it's an interesting question, and we've talked before, for example, not that we necessarily need to get into it again now, about whether the Lib Dems should be effectively leading the charge on a closer relationship with the European Union more than they are, given where the opinion polling is on Brexit. I guess what I would say is it's always very hard to see where the next general election is going to be, what the battleground is going to be, what the question in voters' mind was. For example, if you look at the last election, if you look at Corbyn versus Theresa May, it seemed to me pretty clear, to a degree at the time, but more importantly in retrospect, that what the public thought was a bit hacked off with Theresa May for calling an election we didn't really want, don't think Jeremy Corbyn's going to win, want to give the Tories a bit of a bloody nose, and that's why she ended up losing, effectively losing her majority. So when you look back at an election, you can usually see that it was kind of about one thing. I think the last election was very clearly about, we're just done with the Tories. We're absolutely done with them. They need to go and have a rest. And therefore, a lot of people were drawn to Labour because they wanted to see a government that wasn't the Tories. It's quite hard to see where we're going to be, probably harder than it's ever been in my lifetime covering politics, to see where we're going to be in the next election. Is it effectively going to be that people are very, very hacked off with the Labour government and are really seriously considering reform as an alternative because the Tories have just faded away? Well, that's one scenario that could be a discussion point. Or do Labour still ultimately dominate the battleground, and therefore the Lib Dems do have an opportunity to peel people who are a bit disillusioned with Labour off in greater numbers? So I guess this is a very long and roundabout way of saying that it's really hard to see what the question in voters' minds is going to be in the next election. It will emerge as we get closer to the time. And therefore, it's very hard to know what the Lib Dems should be doing right now to position themselves. Do you think that's fair, or am I getting that wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong, but I still think actually what the Lib Dems should be doing is much simpler than everything you just said implies. And if I were the Lib Dems, I would have only two big policies, and that's all I would talk about from now till the next election. One of them, I mean, they're currently in favour of rejoining the customs union. They ought to be in favour of rejoining the single market, and they ought to be also saying, by the way, this is a stepping stone for rejoining the EU. Why do I say that? It's because actually, the economy is still limping along. We have, we're in this fiscal box where it's incredibly hard for the government to stimulate the economy, whether it's through more investment or, more, essentially their levers for spurring growth are very, very limited. About the only thing they could do to massively increase both private sector investment and indeed significant economic confidence over the medium term would be to commit to a much improved trading relationship with the EU, customs union membership, single market membership. It might, I've talked about how if they would just go for the deal that Theresa May negotiated, it was always rejected by Parliament. You would say totally irrationally, but it is a deal that was on offer, and therefore you have to assume is on offer now. The recent deal that Keir Starmer did with the EU on, fishing and farming adds 0.2% to GDP. Her deal, which is a sort of version of the customs union and single market, but one that preserved some of our national sovereignty issues rather better, that would have added more than 10 times to the size of the UK economy. A really significant increment. I think it's like 2.2%. So, in my view, inexorably, we are heading in the direction of something that looks a bit more like European Union membership because the economics push us in that direction. And if I were the Lib Dems, I would just be massively ahead of the game on that, because voters will reward any party. Public opinion has moved away from Brexit fairly significantly, and B, any party, voters will reward a party that shows courage in moving in the right economic direction. And then separate from all of that, obviously they've historically been massively in favour of voter reform. I happen to think that in this fragmenting world, the debate around the need to change the electoral system so that your vote counts for more, that is going to gain traction. The fragmentation of people want to feel that voting for the party that they think captures their values and the policies that they believe in. I do think that is going to be something that's going to become increasingly important. They've historically been in favour of voter reform. It is crazy to me that they're not pushing it much more loudly, because this is a debate that's not going to go away.
Interesting. Two very different answers there. Take your pick. That's all for this show. Keep sending your questions to talkingpolitics@itv.com or reply to any of our social media posts. Until next time, have a great weekend.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.